Welcome to Lesson 4 of our anger management series, and last week we talked about kind of defining distorted anger, what distorted anger is, as opposed to definitive anger. And just to refresh you on that, definitive anger is when we feel an appropriate response, anger response to what is a true injustice. And so I think the best way to frame it is something that is actually morally wrong, not something that's inconvenient, not something that irritates us, but something that is actually morally wrong. That should trigger anger within us. Now, we've already talked about also, however, that even when it's a legitimate source of anger, a definitive anger, we need to respond to it in the right kind of way and handle and process it in the right kind of way, engaging our reason and being intentional about what we do with our anger. But many of the situations that trigger anger within us are not actually due to a definitive source of anger, not an actual moral wrong that has been done. And so as a byproduct of that, we often experience anger, and because it's not an actual moral wrong that needs to be corrected, we need to handle that anger in a different kind of way. And so we talked about what that distorted anger is in our last lesson, but due to time, we weren't able to talk about how to process that. And so our lesson today is going to focus on processing distorted anger. Now, our quote for the week comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said, "For every minute you are angry, you lose 60 seconds of happiness." And certainly true of that. The reality is that since the fall of man, since Adam and Eve's first sin, the majority of human anger is of the distorted variety. It's not to say that there aren't legitimate reasons to be angry. We've already determined that they are. But most of the time, we aren't really angry over true transgressions or injustices. We are angry because we're irritated or because our expectations have not been met. So one of the things that I do want to highlight before we jump into this is a problem with the modern church. Often the modern church and people within the church, they pride themselves on their tolerance, and specifically their tolerance of sin. But in reality, it is sin that makes God angry, and the consequence and impact upon families and upon lives and of course upon eternity that really makes God angry. So ironically, while people in the modern world, in the modern church, they often get angry, they tend to get angry about the wrong things and don't get angry about the right things. Sin should make us angry. That's not to say that we lash out against sinners, but sin and its destructive consequences should make us angry, should make us want to do something to correct that wrong, to correct that injustice. But many of the things that we actually get angry about instead are things that really aren't a definitive moral injustice, but rather just something that inconveniences us in some way. So let me just elaborate by giving you a case in point, an example that Dr. Chapman gives. So in a phone call with Emily, who is off at university, Emily's mother, whose name is Lynn, they're calling, they're checking in. And as the conversation goes, Lynn asks, "Emily, how are your grades?" Well, Emily says, so-so. You know, I'm getting mostly C's, but there was a class last week where I got my midterm and I'm getting a D in that. It's just something I'm really struggling with. And when Lynn hears this, she's furious about Emily's grades. And so let's just pause right there before we proceed in the narrative and let's ask the question, why is she so angry? Is she angry because of unrealistic expectation? She thinks that Emily has greater capacity and capability than what she actually does. Perhaps she's angry over frustrated personal ambitions. Maybe she looks at it and says, "I never had a chance to go to university, and here, Emily is at university and she's squandering this opportunity. She's missing out and kind of ruining something that I never had a chance to experience." Is she living vicariously? And we'll talk a little bit more about living vicariously in just a moment. But vicarious living is when a parent who has maybe entered into a more boring phase of their lives, nothing exciting, their courtship days, their education days are over, and they're kind of locked into the mundaneness of ordinary life. sometimes they live vicariously through their children. And so they really thrive over their children's accomplishments and their children's relationships. And they're very emotionally invested in their children in an unhealthy kind of way, to where they're actually living vicariously. And so as such, it seems like a child's failure, or where a child comes up short, is actually directly reflected on them. Maybe Lynn is upset because of some resentment over the cost of college and thinking, do you know how much we're paying for this? Or maybe it's hurt pride or status. She wants bragging rights with her friends about how well that Emily is doing, but of course Emily is not doing so well. But the point is that regardless of what any of these things that I've just named, whatever they might be, this is not actually a personal attack on Lynn. It's not like Emily is intentionally getting bad grades to make her mom look bad. Emily, as it turns out, is simply struggling. She's not trying to embarrass her mother. And this illustrates a really important point, and that is so often when parents are angry at their children, their anger is misdirected in that they're actually angry of how their children's actions affect them, how they're embarrassed by those actions, why they cost us money, why they inconvenience us. You know, case in point, the real reason why a parent is often so angry at Walmart at their child's behavior, as their child is throwing a fit or, demanding toys or candy, the real reason why they're so angry in that moment is because they are personally embarrassed by their children's behavior. See, the reality is that if they were, a little more engaged with their children's behavior in other situations, at home, when there aren't a bunch of eyes watching, they probably wouldn't be in this situation. But the reality is it's not so much the child's behavior, per se, that they are angry about. It's that they are being embarrassed, and a lot of people are looking at them in that moment. And so, unfortunately, often parents make things very much about themselves rather than actually dealing with true wrongdoing in their children's lives. So how do we deal with this? Well, a lot of the time we struggle with distorted anger. It is because of our wrong perspectives. Our distorted anger is sparked by factors such as circumstantial evidence. We quickly jump to conclusions and think we know what's going on when we really don't. Faulty presuppositions, generalizations, our own expectations or personal preferences that aren't met, or even just because we're tired, or some combination of the above. But whatever the cause is, the point is this: we conclude incorrectly that we have been wronged. Now, in the case of going back to Lynn and Emily, it's important to recognize that Emily's life, for Lynn, that Emily's life is not her own. And, Emily needs to live her own life, and, maybe she'll deal with some shortcomings and some failures along the way, but at the end of the day, it's Emily's life to live. And so Lynn has to look beyond her own disappointments to the main reason why Emily's actually struggling. If Emily is just slacking, well, that's one thing that requires a certain response. But what if she's just genuinely over her head? Maybe the course load is too difficult for her to keep up with. What if she hasn't been feeling well, or she's struggling with some depression, which is very common amongst university students? What if she's in a program that was more her parents' choice than Emily's own passion, and so she's struggling to really, lock in and love something that really wasn't her choice, but something that was rather thrust upon her? You see, if Lynn is capable of looking beyond her own unfulfilled expectations, she might discover that her daughter desperately needs something other than someone else just piling on her in this moment. But the problem is, of course, is as long as Lynn is angry and she feels like she has been wronged by Emily, she's going to be just focused in and fixated on how she has been done wrong and completely miss out on an area where her daughter might be legitimately struggling. Often as parents, we are guilty of making situations more about us than we do about our children. And when you do that, that is a sure sign of distorted anger. The purpose of anger, it's not to defend our wounded pride or our feelings of embarrassment. It is to right wrongs. Now, that's not to say that we should never not respond to behaviors that aren't sinful, but that could still use some improvement. But what is really important is for us to recognize the difference between a legitimate moral wrong and something that is either an irritant or something that could use some correction but isn't actually a sinful behavior. And if we can mentally distinguish between those two things, we can scale our anger response appropriately. So if we recognize that the person hasn't done anything morally wrong, we can then approach dealing with our hurt and frustration from a different position. We're not judge and jury, that is, standing over them, pronouncing judgment on them, but rather we are recognizing that maybe, just maybe, it's something about them that irritates us. It's not anything that's actually technically wrong with them, but something that is irritating or frustrating us. And we have to solve this problem and deal with our anger in some other way than trying to right a wrong, because no actual wrong has been committed. And so we're going to look at 4 steps that are a part of the right way to process distorted anger. Number 1 is to share information. Number 2 is to gather information. Number 3 is to negotiate understanding. And number 4 is to request change. We'll start by looking at sharing information. As you have probably observed at this point, a lot of anger management and also conflict resolution is about communication. And very frequently, the major problem, for example, in marriage tends to be communication problems. And couples that learn conflict resolution and how to more effectively communicate with each other, there are very few things that they cannot face together and get through if they learn to communicate. Often a fairly simple communication breakdown, however, can cause major disaster within a marriage. So we need to learn to communicate with God, to communicate with others, and to even honestly communicate within ourselves, honest self-reflection. But the problem is that when we're angry, often the first thing that comes out of our mouth is words of judgment. And our, kind of mental process, we skip right over the evidence stage, we jump right over the witness statements, and we get right to pronouncing our verdict. Because we're angry, we assume in that moment, because of that self-righteousness that floods us, that we have everything figured out, we know exactly what is going on, and we are ready to nail them to the wall at that point. We don't do any fact-finding. We don't let the other side present their case. We just pass judgment. It's not unusual in an anger situation that when someone tries to protest their innocence, the response from the angry person is essentially to try to silence them, tell them to shut up, because they assume they have all the facts already. Although unfortunately, they often don't. And when you're in that frame of mind, the problem is that our initial words that flow out of us often come across as very judgmental and very accusatory. They're things like, "You disappointed me. You didn't do what I asked you to do. You let me down." And when we deliver our opening statement in such a way to where it feels like an indictment, like we are passing judgment on them, the guaranteed response from just about anyone is to feel defensive. And not just to feel defensive, but often to feel retaliatory anger because we are being falsely accused of something, or maybe someone is being over the top in their response to something minor that we have done. And so we feel anger in response. And very often, the anger response of someone who is being falsely accused or being aggressively accused is actually more righteous than the anger of the person who is doing the accusing. Something to bear in mind if we were to be angry and to sin not. So the first step to changing these negative outcomes that come as a part of our anger is to start with our very first words. And so one of the great challenges in this moment is to share our point of concern in a way that doesn't feel judgmental. Now I know that's easier said than done, but I hope to give you a little more tools in your tool bag to help to deal with this. So the key here is, instead of attacking, particularly if you have mentally been able to recognize this person has not done something morally wrong. What they are doing, I may not like it, it may irritate me, it may have embarrassed me, but it's not actually sinful. And so thus we can scale our response to, rather than trying to right a wrong, our goal here is to share information. It's to start a conversation. It's to request an opportunity to talk. And the key often to doing this successfully is something called self-deprecation. Self-deprecation means that rather than exalting myself to a position above them in judgment, or even to come at them as an equal, a self-deprecation means that I lower myself down. I have, I add a little vulnerability to my life. To joke in a self-deprecating way is to make, a minor joke about yourself, as a means of making people feel more comfortable. And self-deprecatory talk often helps people to feel less attacked, less condescended to, and, humanizes the person that's trying to initiate the conversation. So instead of coming across as a judge to them, come to them as if you are making a request, which is what you're actually doing. So sharing information can take a form like this, coming to them and saying, I'm feeling, maybe I'm feeling frustrated, I'm feeling angry, I'm feeling upset at something, and I could use your help. I need your help. Or I need you to help me to understand what's going on in this situation because it's causing me some anxiety or causing some tension. So the goal is to approach them in a way that puts them on your side, and so you can solve this problem together, as opposed to attacking them and putting yourself at odds with them. So the goal is to enlist their help in resolving the situation rather than just attacking them because you feel angry. It is telling what you are feeling without passing verdict. Dr. Gary Chapman says you are more likely to be able to do this if you have first determined that the person has not wronged you. He may have made your life difficult, he may have caused you frustration, but he has not committed an immoral act. And when you can frame it in that kind of way, it helps you to be able to take this kind of approach where you're seeking to enlist their help in solving a situation together. And by the way, if you're in a marriage relationship, this is important even if it is a definitive source of anger. You need to solve problems together rather than being on opposing sides. What God has joined together, let not man put asunder. So our first step here is to share information. It is to tell the other person how we feel, but without judgment. The second step is to gather information. Now that we have the conversation started and we have let the other person know that we're feeling frustration, we're feeling anger, that we're feeling, disappointed or frustrated in some way, our next goal needs to be to gather information from them to make sure that we have our facts straight about what is going on. Often we fly off the handle before we really know what's really happened. So let's give you another, scenario that it involves a couple of people where the woman thinks that she knows what's happened. So in this case, Meredith and Jason, they're in a rush. They've had a busy day to this point, and it promises, at least for Meredith, to be a busy evening because right after they finish eating, she has evening school, night school classes, and so she's got to just run right out the door. And so they have a quick meal together, and so she dashes out the door to attend her evening class. 3 hours later, she returns home to find Jason on the couch with a magazine in his lap and the dirty dishes still sitting on the table where they left him. Meredith is immediately flooded with anger. And the thoughts that immediately come to her mind is, I can't believe this. He has sat there on the couch reading that stupid car magazine for hours, and the mess has just been sitting there this whole time while I've been slaving away in class. The aunts have probably come out and cleaned the plates by now, and she thinks, I feel like just going in there and slapping the magazine out of his hands. So Meredith has a few options here at this point. This is how she's feeling. She can conclude that her anger is legitimate and she has been wronged by him, that he intentionally is doing this to lash out at her. And so she can determine that her husband is a no-good, lazy slob. She can respond to him with bitter words. She can withdraw from him in silence. She can show him by being unresponsive to his efforts to initiate sexual intimacy later in the evening. Or she can try to handle her anger in a more responsible manner. Now, if she understands that not doing the dishes within that 3-hour period is not actually a moral evil, it's not a moral wrong, she can recognize, well, maybe I'll determine what's going on. Maybe my anger is misplaced and distorted, and he hasn't done this intentionally to try to hurt me. She can ask herself, what wrong has he committed? And when she is able to say, you know what, he hasn't sinned, the anger can scale down a little bit, and she can approach him and try to get to the bottom of this. Now, if she, looks, and she goes the opposite direction and she says, no, he has sinned against me. She says, if he really loved me, he would have done the dishes, and husbands are supposed to love their wives as Christ loved the church, and this is not an expression of love, and so I have been wronged, and she could go after him. But if she is wise, she will also ask herself, do I have all the facts? I think I do. I come in and I see dishes on the table. I see him on the couch with a magazine. I think I have everything figured out. But if she's wise, she'll understand that, maybe there is some mitigating circumstance. And so she determines that she is going to gather more information from Jason. Now, in this moment, even though she feels like she has a situation all figured out, if she just acts on what she thinks she knows, this is a moment that could turn into a deeply bitter situation. If she actually did lash out at him and attack him and tell him that he's worthless and slap the magazine out of his hands and throw a tantrum, this is just the kind of moment where the end of many marriages has begun. In a moment like this where there's a misunderstanding and someone reacts in anger and the seeds of resentment and bitterness are sown in that moment. So fortunately, since we get to make up this story here tonight, Meredith is deciding that she is going to gather information. So sitting next to him on the couch, she leans over and she gives him a kiss. And she says, I have one small question before I give you another kiss. She says, why are the dirty plates still on the table? Jason responds, oh, babe, I'm sorry. I sat down here to read a few minutes first, and I meant to clean up as soon as I finished reading this article, but I've been so exhausted. You know how I was up late last night working on a project, and I sat down to read, and all of a sudden I was out like a light, and I didn't wake up until I heard you unlocking the door. I didn't even know how long I slept. He says, I'm sorry, I'll get the dishes. I must have been just really exhausted. So he stands up, he stretches, he goes to the kitchen, and as he's walking, he calls back over his shoulder, how was your class? Now, there's a good chance in this moment that his response, both the understanding of what drove him to that moment, but also the fact that he isn't lashing out at her, he isn't angry at her, it's a good chance that Meredith's anger is already beginning to subside, as it settles in that Jason was not intentionally trying to hurt her. His failure to clean up was not a sin. Falling asleep because he is tired is not immoral. It's just human. And so in the very process of gathering information, it has allowed Meredith to release her anger and to accept that her husband is human after all. So we may discover that when we gather information that our anger was misplaced, and very often if that is what happens, then we will feel closure already. We'll recognize that we were angry, but we were angry because we didn't really understand what was going on. And so our anger has a natural dissipation that begins to take place. But if after gathering information we are still angry, let's just say in the previous scenario that, that Jason was just being insensitive, maybe not intentionally trying to hurt her, but there's no real legitimate excuse there. Maybe she is still angry. And that leads us on to our next step, step 3, which is negotiating understanding. We could also call this coming to terms. So sometimes when our anger is distorted, we cannot simply release it and accept what the other person has done. Often this comes because there's maybe a pattern of behavior rather than an isolated incident. And so we may have shrugged it off once or twice before, but when we see a recurring pattern, we feel like there is something more fundamentally wrong within the relationship. It's here where we need to negotiate understanding, because even if what the other person is doing is not morally wrong, his or her behavior can still be painful to us. We still feel disappointed, frustrated, hurt, and angry. And if this pattern continues, it can cause irreparable damage to the fabric of relationship. And so there are 2 things that need to happen during negotiating understanding or coming to terms. You need to understand the person's actions, but he or she also needs to understand your feelings and how their actions are impacting you. So you need to come to terms with the situation. And the key, once again, is communication. You're hurting, and if you don't communicate your resentment, it will just continue to grow and fester within you. So the key to negotiating understanding is to have an open conversation in a non-judgmental environment. And again, like we said earlier on, one of the keys to creating a non-judgmental environment is to acknowledge the difference between being inconvenienced and or irritated and actually being more morally wronged. If we can put our anger in the right context, we can recognize that, yeah, it does irritate me, it does make me angry, but it's not a moral wrong. And so I can't come across here judgmentally. I need to come across in a way that hopefully can achieve some kind of understanding where we can make this relationship work better. So let's pause right here and just observe a general observation about men and women who are often wired very differently. And one of those things that is part of, not to say that it's universally true, but it's often true, and that is that men need to fix things. It's part of their instinct. And in most relationships, certainly in the stereotype, the honey-do list is not a list that a man has created for his wife. Honey, do this, honey, do that. But rather it's a list that the wife has created for her husband. And often it's things that need to be fixed around the home. Little chores or even major chores that need to be dealt with. And so, very often it's men that either fix things or they're the ones that, that if it's beyond their capabilities or they don't have time to do it themselves, they're the ones that are bringing something in to be fixed. I don't know that my wife has ever initiated a repair on any of our vehicles that we own together, but always it is me that is taking care of, changing the oil, or if there's any more major repairs to be done, it's always me that either does it or initiates it getting done. That's part because I'm wired to fix things. Women don't always want things to be fixed. And when I say that, I'm not talking, don't worry, she does want that leaking toilet to be fixed, or, she does want that loud muffler to be fixed. That's not what I'm referring to. But what I'm talking about here is emotional or relational things, to where sometimes a woman or a wife is coming to her husband not looking for him to provide some kind of solution. And in fact, if he tries to propose a solution, it may just irritate her further. But often she is just looking for an opportunity to express how she feels. And, in that moment, she may even recognize that how she feels is somewhat irrational, but it doesn't change what she is feeling. So here's a point I want to make before we move on. One of these approaches is not right while the other is wrong. God designed us differently intentionally. So men need to recognize that there are moments when their wives just need to vent. And women need to recognize that if they speak to their husband about a problem, her husband is going to be wired towards trying to find a solution or to propose a solution. So both parties need to recognize the needs of others and be willing to compromise. Now, the key to these negotiations is often determined by the opening words, which is why it's important to recognize the truth of two biblical passages. Proverbs 15:1 says, "A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger." And so the Bible describes could be the same thing that is being said in two different ways. But one way is going to turn away wrath. It is going to deflect or deflate wrath, while a harsh approach, a militant approach, is going to stir up anger. It's going to be throwing accelerant onto a fire. Proverbs 25:11 says, "A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver." Taking the time to carefully choose your words in a way that is designed to calm them rather than to attack them or to judge them, as we've said before. Choosing that properly can be a work of art, the writer of the Proverbs said. And so the way that you approach the other party will often set the terms of engagement, so to speak. And so remember, this is not an attack. This is not you with the moral high ground, but rather you are framing your need, your hurt, and what you perceive as the cause. As long as the two parties are defensive, there's not going to be any resolution to this. I think that most people would think of me as being a reasonable person, but I can tell you I am not reasonable when I am defensive, when my back is up, so to speak, and I feel like I'm under attack. I'm ready to defend myself. and not really opening to any kind of negotiation in that moment. And so it's in this moment that it is important to recognize that what I'm saying about myself, I believe, is something that is true of most people. And so if it is a defensive situation, if it's a highly emotionally charged situation, there's a good chance there's not going to be a productive outcome. So this is a stage where it's important to be honest. You need to express what you are feeling, and that is necessary. But it's equally important to not be cruel, but to be kind in the way that you speak. The Bible says to speak the truth in love. And we need to remember that truth is not to be wielded as a bludgeon or a club, but rather it is to be used as a balm to bring healing. So don't make them guess at what you're feeling and why, but rather be honest about it, but be honest about it in a caring fashion. This is much better, by the way, than carrying resentment and anger. Open negotiations, start to talk about what's going on. But let me just give you a little bit of an idea about the idea of a negotiation. In North America, we don't really do a whole lot of bartering. We go into a store and the price is either on the product or on the shelf. You don't take that, that item up to a Walmart clerk and say, you know what, this says it's $29.99. I'll give you $15 for it. They're not going to barter back and forth and then set the value at some agreement in between. But you can be in places, in traveling different places around the world, other countries, I've been in situations where I have been bartering to where, you approach a stall. Some of my favorite experiences like that have been in bazaars in Old City, Jerusalem. And so there, you're engaging with the person and they ask for an amount to start off that they're not going to get. You offer a price that is so low, they're not going to accept it. And so the exchange goes back and forth, and typically you're going to land somewhere there in the middle. So they're not going to get maybe everything that they would have liked to have gotten for the item, and you're going to pay maybe a little bit more than what you hoped to pay in that situation. That's negotiation. And this is a much more accurate depiction of what's going to happen in a relational negotiation than rather you just getting to slap a price on the product and say, this is what you're going to pay. It doesn't work that way. So we need to recognize that there is going to be some, as we're calling this, it is a negotiating of understanding. There's going to be some bartering. You have to recognize you may not get everything that you want. And they're going to have to recognize that for the sake of peace and unity within that relationship, they may have to give a little bit more than what they would like. But negotiating understanding is an important part of human relationships, because even if you don't get everything that you want, the fact that you have openly spoken about it and negotiated actually helps to clear the air, and it lets you know where you stand in the relationship. And so it's a hugely important part of any human relationship, whether it's a relationship in the family, it's a relationship in the church, in your workplace, or in other areas. All of us feel better about our relationships when we negotiate understanding. There have been things along the way, my wife and I have been married for over 23 years. There have been some things along the way that we've had to negotiate. We've had to say, okay, we recognize that we have, slightly different viewpoints on this particular issue. And so we have come to a place where we've agreed upon, okay, this is where this issue is going to stand, and this is how we're going to handle it. And while it may not have been either one of our direct preference, that negotiated position is something we can both be comfortable with, and we can, maybe lower our defenses a little bit because we know that we have negotiated something that we have agreed to, and it helps us to know where we stand. Even if you're feeling distorted rather than definitive anger, it often indicates that something needs attention. Maybe that something is just within you, but often it is within, the friction points of a relationship. And such anger, it rarely dissipates without open, loving communication between the two parties involved. So at this stage, hopefully you have been able to, negotiate and have come to a point of agreement. But let's just say that has failed. And so at this stage, there has been no voluntary proposal of change on behalf of the other person. And so then you can move on to the final stage with distorted anger, and that is requesting change. Now let's pause, and I would like you to repeat with me, requesting change. Remember, when there is not a moral wrong that has been committed, you cannot demand change. You may not like that your spouse bites their fingernails, but that is not something that's going to send them to hell. And so you have to recognize that you may request them to change that behavior, but you need to recognize from your own life that making change is difficult. And so you can request it, but you cannot demand it. There is nothing sinful or morally wrong that is being done. It's just something that irritates you. And so you can request change. In any human relationship, there are going to be friction points, as I refer to them. In every human relationship, people will find certain behavioral characteristics irritating. And often, for example, in a marriage relationship, when they're in that euphoric infatuation stage, they don't hardly see the irritating flaws of the other person. And at some point, often into marriage a little ways, where the euphoria starts to wear off and they start to become more aware of the flaws and the irritating characteristics of the other person. But in any relationship, there are going to be those friction points, just things about the way that a person behaves or even their personality that rubs us the wrong way. So for the most part, our anger that we would feel towards that, these irritations, it's distorted anger. Very likely what they're doing is not morally wrong. They're not perpetrating an evil towards us, and they're probably not even doing it. And let's go back to the biting the nails. They're probably not doing that as a means of lashing out at you. It's not an attack against you. It's just a bad habit that they have developed at some point, maybe a response to stimulus like anxiety or stress. And so in this case, we may want to see change, but we have to request it. We can't demand that change, nor should we try to manipulate that person into changing against their will. And here is a really good pointer on this subject. If you have demonstrated in times past that you are unwilling to change when change is requested, you're unlikely to find a whole lot of favor when you request others to change. Again, this is about compromise. We demonstrate that we're willing to give in order to achieve a better relationship. And so if we request change in an affirming way, accompanied with an explanation, we will, often find in a healthy relationship that the other party is willing to make small changes for the good of the relationship. And remember, I said small changes. I mean, sometimes, there have been, young ladies, for example, that have said about the man that they plan to marry, well, he's not much now, but, just give me a chance and I'll make something of him. That is naivete talking. Good luck with that. Major change is hard. And if you think you're going to be able to request a massive major change in a person's life, you may have unrealistic expectations. But small changes for the sake of a relationship, compromises, often people will be willing to make that. And as Mary Poppins once famously said, a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down, the medicine go down, the medicine go down. The bottom line is that in most relationships, assuming that we feel loved and respected by the other person, most of us are willing to make some changes if they are couched in the form of a request rather than a demand. And as long as there is some understanding that lasting change is hard. And so let me just make this point as I draw to a conclusion. Lasting change is hard. So just because the person you're in a relationship says, I'm going to try to change that, it doesn't mean that they're going to perfectly do it. With our illustration of biting and nails, it may have been weeks that go by and you catch them biting their nails again. It doesn't mean that they still don't have willingness to change, but you need to recognize that real change is difficult. And if you fly down their throats and attack them at that moment, you're going to undo all the goodwill that you have generated at this point. We have to be careful at this stage to be realistic about the changes that we are requesting. If the person considers our request to be unreasonable and they're not willing to make that change, we have to make a choice at that point to develop a thicker skin and maybe to just learn to cope with some things that are not our preference. We cannot demand that change. They're not doing anything wrong. We must just request it and hope for the best. Any successful relationship is going to be a combination of minor changes that people have made, along with a willingness on the part of the other to accept that there are some things that we just have to live with. And arriving at that place and adjusting your expectations is also a way of releasing that anger to where you're not constantly feeling that little friction point and being consumed with the distorted anger. So next week we're going to take a look at explosions and implosions. In other words, both explosive anger and implosive brooding anger and the passive-aggressive behavior that this often brings. And maybe it will help you to understand the kind of anger you experience and to avoid some of the pitfalls that come with that. I hope that once again this lesson has been helpful to you and this series has been helpful. If you want to see more of the lessons, if you'll look in the description of the video down below, you can find a link to the whole playlist for this particular series. And so I hope you'll check it out. God bless you. I pray that you will grow in your walk with God and your relationship with other people through this series. Have a great, blessed day.